Welcome everybody to the final session of the day. We have a topic on the role of anthropologists in the resource sector in Western Australia, which of course follows on nicely from what we've just heard from Gareth and the other speakers, surrounding the role of anthropology, the expectations put upon anthropologists, and as well as the kind of analyses that take place in the area of cultural heritage work. We have three presentations in this session, 10 minutes each, and we'll go through them one by one. The first speaker is Daniel Bruckner. He is a consultant working in the cultural heritage work in Western Australia. He is going to speak about, the Juukan Gorge context of the Aboriginal Heritage Act reforms in WA and the kind of whole political context of this kind of work in Australia today. Very briefly, I'm just introducing the topics. We then have another consultant, Dirima, speaking about the relatively new concept of social surroundings that is used in Western Australia in assessments of big projects. And that is also the topic of the two WIMAC staff members who will present at the end, Corey Herman and Amy Usher. So that's the introductions. Daniel, over to you, and then we'll go through it, followed by the questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you very much. I'll try to stick to the clock down there, because 10 minutes is short and there is a lot of matters to discuss, especially in the WA context. So a lot of you would know that there's been, not only the Juukan situation, but also the change in the Aboriginal heritage legislation. So there is a lot of movement at the moment. There is a time that I would call a transitional period, which is changing how we're working, perceiving and acting in the Indigenous estate at the moment. So primarily I separate these two areas into an external and an internal change. So the external change meaning we do have a new Aboriginal heritage legislation. When we've put the program together, I was writing in there that there is a change on the horizon. Now, on the 22nd of December, the governor has signed the new Aboriginal heritage legislation and it's going through a royal assent. So that means from that day onwards, that legislation is active. There is, as far as I understand, a transitional period where there is still consultation in relation to the regulation and how this bill is going to be enacted. But again, there is very little guidance from the government on the practicalities. Equally, and I think WIMAC's going to talk about this later, we have the EPA, which is state legislation in the environment space, which have entered the Aboriginal heritage landscape about 2 years ago with the concept of social surrounds as a result of the Bibra Lake cases and also the strategic environmental assessment that BHP had done at the time. So suddenly we have two legislators on a state level. We've got the native title federal legislation, which is currently also being reviewed, and then obviously influenced by the Juukan situation, the EPBC Act federal is under review, and equally starts to mix and mingle in the world of heritage and native title. So these external changes, or this environment is what now our Aboriginal stakeholders and traditional owners are confronted with. And in their world, there is equally a change. And I would say that's, from my view, the internal change. a change in the way that management of heritage is perceived, and the Jukan situation, which I was involved in as the anthropologist for PKKP, highlighted a lack of process and a lack of communication and a lack of understanding on how cultural heritage is managed. So the cultural heritage and native title, sort of, I would almost call it industry, is heavily influenced in Western Australia, obviously, by mining. And mining traditionally has seen native title and heritage predominantly through a legal lens. And I like David Trigger's term on this, because that is the problem that we had initially, that like all of this work that we're doing as anthropologists is heavily influenced by the legal framework in which we operate, and the language that we're using. And going back to what Gareth was saying, even the language of loss that is available to us in that discourse is a legal language. So I'm fully with Gareth that we don't even have the words to describe what is actually happening in the internal side of the Indigenous estate. Now, the other thing that has changed is obviously post-Jukan, the resource sector has started looking at heritage and native title beyond just legal requirements, but what the reputational implications are for the destruction of cultural heritage. And that has led to a whole bunch of really obscure responses. And I'm consulting to various developers, but Aboriginal groups at the same time. And I think you could call it a state of confusion on both ends, where there is no guidance from the legislator and regulator. And there is a change in sentiment on both ends, whilst we're at a time where the loss of Aboriginal heritage is definitely accumulating, which makes the assessment of significance of cultural places very difficult, because it is just a snapshot in time. And it's only the information that you're being provided by the knowledge holders, which unfortunately, most of us who work in the field will know that we're now at this stage almost on a monthly to bi-monthly basis, attending funerals where some of the senior people are leaving us with a lot of this knowledge being gone. And we're going through a process of trying to like recreate these narratives and reinvigorate traditional knowledge and the knowledge about place and space. So the question that David was asking me is, where do you see the role of anthropologists in that? And I do think that I see us in that field of the tension between the external changes of the legislation and the expectations from resource companies, and the changes that we see within the Indigenous estate to be there as a group of people that are informed and educated in that space and can translate as good as possible, even though we don't have all of the words for it, and where we're required also mediate between these various parties. So I think what's happening in Western Australia at the moment is going to be quite stressful over the next 18 to 24 months without a lack of guidance. I think the only area that will help us is if some of these legislative changes and some of these actions that we've seen in the past go through the court system. I like the way that David termed or used the term cultural amnesia and historical amnesia, but we also see that there is significant amnesia within the resource companies and equally significant amnesia within government. There is almost only the court system that we're currently being able to look at to see what all of these legislative changes mean and how we can translate them and find consents, because at the same time as all of this happens, And I'm pretty sure somebody has brought FPIC up before. How does free, prior, informed consent fit into this concept? And is it a veto right? There's just so many questions around that. But I'll leave it as this, knowing that my 10 minutes are over, so that it's enough time for my peers to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Over to Dharma, who's going to be speaking about social surroundings. Thank you, Dharma.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so my name's Dharma Cuthbert. I'm an anthropologist working on social surroundings in Western Australia. I've got a PowerPoint presentation which I would like to share, but I can't actually see how to do that on this screen. Sorry, that should be just popping up for me, but it's not at this moment.
It's a share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, I can't actually see where it says share screen. Oh, there it is, sorry. Okay, now got it. Okay. All right. Okay, can you see that? The red, is the red one showing for you? The title page?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so yeah, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country, Whadjuk country, which is where I'm sitting today, and also traditional owners throughout the Pilbara, where some of this work has been defined. Okay, so social surroundings, as Daniel mentioned, is required for significant projects such as new mines under the Environmental Protection Act in WA to understand the impacts that a proposal is likely to have on the social, cultural, ecological, aesthetic and spiritual values associated with the place where the mine or other development is proposed. They're actually additional to the Aboriginal Heritage Surveys under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. And they can record some of the same content, but they also capture information that the Aboriginal Heritage Act doesn't. Social surroundings assessments are young, as Daniel mentioned. They're actually just rolling out across the Pilbara. In most people's countries, we're only up to the first or second one. They're also public documents, so it's really important that we keep that in mind as to how we interpret and communicate information. There are opportunities to add value as well for people, culture and country through social. There's actually three key parts to social surroundings assessments. They're not necessarily undertaken consecutively, but the first one is identifying the values in or associated with a proposal area. Then it's about assessing the impact of the proposal on those values. And lastly, it's about planning and management actions to avoid, minimise or manage this impact. I've highlighted this one in orange because this is often the one that resource companies want anthropologists to be hired for. But if you actually want to keep the traditional owner voice all the way through, and because traditional owners also have lots to say about assessing impacts and planning and management actions, the model that I use tends to follow and include all of this information in our reporting. So social surroundings assessments are a work in progress. They're still under development. There's no one way to do them at this point in time. But what we tend to do is develop terms of reference and a scope of work with traditional owners, the PBCs and proponents to manage expectations right from the start. There's usually a field trip component, could be one or more, with the same or different traditional owner teams whose country might be impacted by the proposal. In our particular team, we also have an environmental advisor to provide independent advice on the potential impacts of the proposal to traditional owners. And we also have a filmmaker to record the process and other outcomes. Obviously, there's very careful discussion around where that film goes. In some cases, with traditional owner permission, that goes right through to the EPA. In other cases, it's footage that's kept for internal use. There's ongoing traditional owner review and evaluation through meetings, presentations and draft reports from each field trip, and their feedback is folded into the process as we go. In the past, we've had consolidation meetings with everyone who participated in field trips to bring the results together and resolve any inconsistencies. And last of all, we produce a final report, which then goes on to inform the social, cultural and heritage management plan, which is submitted to the EPA. Just in terms of the field trips, I just want to give a bit of an indication of the sorts of things that are discussed, which go over and above other sorts of compliance legislation. So we're often asked things like, what plants are here? What's their meaning, purpose and value? That could be asked in relation to animals, water, a whole range of factors. Then we might go on to consider, if the purpose of this plant is to attract a particular animal, what does that animal mean to you? For example, the sound of birdsong, collecting honey from native bees, hunting kangaroos, totemic relationships, etc., to start building a relational picture of that place and those people. If this type of plant was to disappear from this location, perhaps because the catchment where it's growing will be reduced by the proposal and water will be scarce, how would that affect the animals at this place, and how would those effects affect you, for example, your diet? If you could no longer access this place because of mine operations, how would that affect this plant? There's a good question in the chat that popped up earlier, which I think we'll need to address in discussion as to how much of this information actually goes through to the EPA, but I'll leave that for that discussion. We'll also usually go through the same sort of scenarios for a range of values, like I said, water, animals, hills, ranges and more. And we also consider temporality. So do things change at night time or in different seasons? Has this situation changed over your lifetime, so that we can start to get an idea of cumulative impacts, particularly in areas that have been subject to mining? This is an example of how values can actually be communicated in a public document with traditional owner permission. This one just shows whether values were absent or present at a particular location. The information along this side axis being collected from field trips and discussions, so that obviously changes depending on where you are. Information on the top quite frequently stays the same, people seeing themselves as part of that landscape with plants and animals, hills and ranges. People also included down the side as the repositories for the knowledge of things like water, plants, and how these meet these other cultural values. So I guess this is like trying to show that cultural values, you know, are relational, are interconnected, and that we don't often know exactly what they look like. We also produce narrative maps. Film is really important, and audio recordings, and some of that with traditional owner permission goes through to the EPA, like I mentioned. So to sum up, social surroundings are a new way for traditional owners to have a say over what happens to their country. And together we try to create opportunities for their voices to be heard through the design, implementation and communication of the social surroundings assessment. Getting social surroundings assessments right with each group takes a lot of cooperation from everyone involved. Sometimes that means something simple, like for example, when we realised that some women couldn't attend because they were getting their kids to school, it was just a matter of starting later. It's always too slow for some people and too fast for others. But they do represent an opportunity for anthropology and anthropologists to ensure that traditional owners' voices, which have been typically limited in compliance work, are heard and acted on. So I'd just like to say thanks to the Pilbara traditional owners and their PVCs who've guided us in doing social surroundings assessments on their country, and to the proponents who've supported this work. Also to you for listening, and in keeping with our approach, I really hope that next time this presentation will actually be led by a traditional owner. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dirma. If you could close your screen, we'll move to the final presentation, which is by Corey and Amy from WIMAC. Thank you.
Cool. All right, so you guys can hear us all right?
Yeah, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Hi guys, my name's Corey Herman. I'm an anthropologist with Yamatji Marlborough Aboriginal Corporation. I've been with the company for 7 years and have worked across a number of sort of subfields with native title, cultural heritage, and project space, mainly in the traditional ecological knowledge recording space.
And I'm Amy Usher. I'm the research manager at WIMAC, and also just like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people on whose land that we're presenting today.
So our presentation is fairly informal, and I think it's a kind of critical reflection, passing on from Dirima's really informative what is a social surroundings project or this emerging space. I think probably touching on that point about there's not really a one size fits all, and also this is an emerging space here in WA, and there's probably various reasons why it's more important at the moment. But I think we're, as a discipline in this new space, just kind of reflecting and finding our way through it. And I think if we, we share our ideas and so forth for methodologies, I think that'll go a long way. I think that's probably my presentation is kind of a critical reflection of myself being involved in a social surroundings project, in a consultation and an assessment. My first kind of reflection is that, like, in fact, there kind of was no real sort of methodology that kind of fitted correctly, I guess, except for kind of like social impact assessment methodologies or cultural heritage methodologies. My reflection is that none of them adequately kind of address this sort of work. It's one of these sort of nexus of various kind of methodologies and disciplines and ideas. So I guess that's why I think it's probably a core reason why anthropologists should be involved in this this space, kind of to advocate for sort of and develop kind of cross-cultural models for assessing and reporting these sort of things. Obviously, Dirima's gone into the kind of concept of what is social surroundings. I mean, it's been around for a long time. I think it's probably had an increased focus, probably in light of things like Juukan Gorge and the weakness of the old WA Heritage Bill from 1972, and then probably also the new legislation, which here in WA is still a contested space. My view is that that social surroundings projects or research projects are kind of a constructive collaboration between proponents and traditional owners, whereby the impacts to communities are identified and strategies for their mitigation or elimination are developed. The important thing for impacts to be assessed under the EPA guidelines is it highlights that these impacts have to be significant. And I think that's probably why anthropologists are well placed to be involved in this work, because there's an element of making an assessment of the significance. Kind of touching on kind of the thing that David spoke about right at the very beginning. So what role do anthropologists play in this process? I think it's probably established, and I would argue that's a necessity for anthropologists to be involved in the social surroundings. So what are the roles that they might play in this process? I think, firstly, I kind of see anthropologists as a facilitator in this process. It obviously involves, as Dirham has said, like many expertise. However, the nature of social surroundings and its intersection between kind of social, cultural, and biophysical elements lends itself to the expertise of an anthropologist, who often draws on multiple cross-cultural systems and fields of research to kind of understand social phenomena and cultural manifestations. So this, in our opinion, probably would place anthropologists at a distinct advantage in this space. I also believe that anthropologists should act as an advocate in this space, and this is consistent with international social impact assessment methodologies. I think it's the one area in which we should feel free to advocate for traditional owners, which is quite different to how we might operate or perform our duties in native title, for example. As an advocate, I think we should seek to place traditional owners' views at the centre of the consultation and how the results are communicated back to proponents or developers. I think this is important because internationally and at home, I still think, you know, that Indigenous people or traditional owners are still feeling and still are marginalised from a lot of these processes. That being said, in the advocacy space, all the time, of course, holding to our kind of objective professional practices. The third sort of role I see anthropologists is as a communicator or translator. So the anthropologist should not replace the voice of traditional owners, but assist where possible to kind of articulate those concerns and views and ways of managing country. I see the anthropologists able to assist in a translation of also that highly technical information, you know, breaking it down for traditional owners. And I think we're used to, in the native title and cultural heritage space, doing that. So I think that that's a good place for us to continue that. And also think it stands to reason that that anthropologists have a level of like expertise and professional training to listen to traditional owners, identify social and cultural impacts associated with project proposals, and to analyse and communicate those impacts to representative bodies, proponents, TOs, or government agencies. So who else should be involved? And the clear answer is there's a lot of people, not just the anthropologists. But I think it's important to highlight that, because early in my experience with this, it was kind of, proponents kind of expected that the kind of anthropologist could be all things to all people and tick all boxes and communicate all information, or assess all elements of the social surroundings. And I think there was an element of kind of managing that expectations both from proponents and from traditional owners. And this is not the case with social surroundings research analysis, as it's representative of a nexus between social, cultural, environmental impacts. That is, each affects each other, which is particularly so with traditional owner perceptions and relationships to their sentient landscapes. Identifying and assessing impacts to traditional owners' social surroundings requires a cross-disciplinary approach with input from a variety of experts. And Dirima touched on that, where it's a matter of having environmental expertise, even legal expertise, and anthropological, archaeological, so forth. It's a kind of a team approach, I think, would be the best practice. And also, social surroundings is research or results is also a synchronization between social and environmental knowledge and traditional owner knowledge systems. So it's a team. So these are just my perspectives on kind of what works and what doesn't. And there's lots of things, but we don't have a lot of time. Like the process of a collaboration between experts is really, really important, because the way that an impact to waterways or dust or a haul road might restrict access to country all has multiple things that aren't just social impacts, but feed into that. Other thing that traditional owners need to be at the center of the consultation, communication and dialogue, always driving the consultation. It's essential that consultations occur on country, I believe, and that you visit and stand in situ where the actual impacts are likely to occur. And it helps in the Pilbara if you have a chopper, that really helps. Observe places of similar impacts that are being proposed, such as similar size mining pits, infrastructure, haulage roads, and so forth. And environmental impacts such as, like, you know, dust and water depletion, just to name a few. Agree on timeframes, resources, and outcomes. I think Dirima talked about that with the scope of works. It's important to understand that that's important because these things can't be rushed, or they're likely not to really fit that model of the free, prior, informed consent, or lead to satisfactory agreement making or decision making. And to have those outcomes and management strategies agreed to and committed to by proponents in whatever way. Other reflections are that I think there's challenges and opportunities in this space. I'll start with a few of the challenges I've experienced. The first is that often this space is a deeply, and I'm sure everybody understands, is a deeply contested political space. There are conflicting agendas between proponents and traditional owners, and at times, and within organisations and within community groups, different ideas of what is acceptable and so forth. Tensions between caring for country on the one hand, and then the very real financial gains that can be leveraged through these processes and the mining agreements. And that tension is often one of the most difficult things to deal with as an anthropologist. Conflicting and disparities with access to resources between proponents and traditional owners. This includes time, money, and people. Often proponents have all the resources, putting some traditional owner groups and their representative bodies at a distinct disadvantage. Also, discrepancies in technical access to expertise. Mining companies often have a battalion of people working on community and environmental approvals, while prescribed body corporates or rep bodies are often already drowning in their current native title and heritage obligations, and that puts them at a disadvantage. And often it's very difficult for some proponent technical advisors to understand traditional owner concerns and views, even when they communicate that on country. I've had some trouble explaining to hydrologists water values, especially when information is culturally sensitive, or TOs just simply do not feel comfortable talking with strangers about such things. So, and also sometimes there's a desire to, there's not a desire to engage in these different worldviews, and that can be a real challenge. This, I think, is really important, is that what I've found the consultation process can be quite traumatic for TOs. It's a confronting process to go on country and understand and visualize the damage that's going to happen to the physical landscape, and for TOs to understand what that means for their cultural values and for their community health and well-being, for example. And this can actually also be a barrier for TOs wanting to engage in the process. I've had many people wanting to switch off because they just don't want to engage in that pain. And in some instances, this manifests in actual real outpourings of grief, which can be very difficult for anthropologists to deal with. So yeah, one thing I'm constantly aware of is the way in which our work in native title, cultural heritage damage to sites, consultation around this is the plans for your country, the idea that this can trigger or re-trigger already underlying trauma, I think is something that we really need to always bring at the forefront of the work that we do. And Amy will probably talk a little bit from her perspective about how these consultation assessment projects are really massive undertakings for organisations, and I don't think we really understood that in the beginning. But there's opportunities and in the process, and there's opportunities to also refocus the narrative. So I'd suggest looking at creating tangible outcomes for TO groups through this process, in particularly have these enshrined in mechanisms such as these cultural, social cultural heritage management plans. These can be win-wins for TOs and proponents, such as ranger projects that can assist in mitigating or managing or eliminating impacts, and projects that allow for the preservation and protection of, as Daniel was saying, the knowledge loss. Groups that I've worked with have articulated that they've felt a little bit marginalised in the process and have been brought into the process a little bit late. So it's important that they're not, of course, and that this is done early. And a good example is this is often mining companies will present that they've done years and years and years of baseline environmental work, and now they're just getting to, so, what are your values? Whereas that baseline should have been done at the beginning. And because environmental and social cultural for traditional owners is so interconnected, it has to be done at the start together, I think. And we've also made it clear, TOs that I work with, yep, Kim, I'm almost done, is that TOs want the right to say no to elements of proposals. And that for some people has felt like a really different kind of framing of the narrative, when sometimes, maybe there are agreements or so forth, or that they just didn't realise that they should be able to articulate that.
Thanks, Corey. Kim, I'm assuming we've run out of time.
Yeah, it is. You want to say a few things though, Amy? I mean, we've got some time. Yep. We've got some leeway, but only a few minutes, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Yeah, no, look, I really am just reiterating what Corey said, and I will be really brief. And I think, I think, to be fair, there was a level of naivety from our part when we kind of first entered into these projects, and it became a lot bigger than first anticipated. So whilst we were really keen to get into the space, especially when groups were kind of seeking advice and support from us, it really did snowball and become really quite resource intensive. And that real disparity between what we thought the anthropologist's role was going to be and then what it actually ended up being as well. So Corey kind of essentially became this project manager and a liaison between the proponent and the group, which caused a lot of extra work and pressure. And I think one of the key things that came out of that was, you know, some of the proponent reps not necessarily understanding the process themselves and really appreciating that this is an emerging space for a lot of people. So the pressure that was then felt because of expectations and timeframes, outcomes, you know, did lead to some frustration from, you know, traditional owners and also from staff as well. I think as a manager as well, it also became really important to be mindful of the pressure that staff are under with these sorts of projects. And Corey sort of briefly mentioned as well that idea of, or that risk of re-triggering trauma when you're out in the field. And then also that vicarious trauma, I think, that can be experienced by anthropologists that are working in this field, along with, you know, other things that we do as part of native title. So I think it's really important for continued training and collegial support in the space, and, you know, where we can, sharing those experiences, processes, tips, and having forums to be able to do that as well. And just one last thing about resourcing as well. I think, you know, often rep bodies or land councils have the right mix of staff with experience, the willingness to train or be a part of these projects, but it is really hard to try and prioritize those things with, you know, the funded work that we have to do as well, especially when you're kind of unsure of what the scope is at the beginning of those projects. Balancing the really tight timeframes, which is one of the things that, you know, that we felt that there seemed to be this real push to get things done quite quickly, reporting, field trips, consultations. So on a positive note, that has led to a lot of internal discussions here at WIMAC with the idea of having a particular team taking carriage of these projects and then having anthropologists come in with their sort of expertise for specific things, and also a bit of a push to employ people to really focus in that space as well. So that's a positive thing.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Corey. And of course, thank you, Daniel and Dirama.